Good evening and welcome to the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas online public lecture series. Before we begin, as a reflection of this institution's recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, the University of Tasmania acknowledges the traditional owners, the Palawa people, and custodians of the land upon which we meet. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and recognise the enormous contribution their knowledge systems have to play to our creating a sustainable future. This Island of Ideas series was commenced last year to keep ideas flowing during a time where getting together live was difficult. And we've continued it this year because it's been possible to reach a wide audience through having it all online. And tonight's the last of our Island of Ideas series for 2021. And through these programs, we've seen over 8,000 members of the Tasmanian community and beyond participate in 25 talks. They are part of the university's broad range of programs, of lectures and forums and seminars designed to support our ongoing conversations about topics that are really important. And tonight is certainly very much one of them, as we look towards the question of towards a climate positive Tasmania, building on and responding to work that the Universities of Tasmania's Policy Exchange has done. So before we get into that though, just a few housekeeping notes. Your microphone, camera, chat function and raised hand have been disabled so that our speakers can continue uninterrupted, but we are super keen on your questions. So that can be done anytime by putting them in the Q&A function that you'll see on your screen. And you can, of course, ask questions anonymously, and I'll use a selection of those to put to our panelists to keep the discussion flowing. And this will be recorded for later access on our YouTube and SoundCloud channels. As we head into this topic, I think we're all very conscious of the timing in which this occurs. With the closure of COP26 and a sense, I think, amongst many of disappointment that we needed to go further and faster than the world was managed to agree upon. And yet, here in Tasmania, we're in a very different circumstance to many parts of the world, with already a net positive, net carbon positive environment, where we actually have to look to what new policy options are available to us to continue to lead the world in what it would look like to transition to the kind of society and economy that 2050 is all about. The Tasmanian Policy Exchange has highlighted to us that it isn't just a question of net for Tasmania, but we need to tackle our gross emissions. We need to find ways to transition the breadth of our economy to be a truly climate positive state. It's a conversation that we need to have right across our economy and figure out the kind of questions and ways forward for Tasmania, so that not only can we maintain our net positive state, but perhaps more importantly, take being one of the few net positive places in the world and demonstrate how we can actually bring the gross emissions down and truly embody a long-term sustainable economy compatible with the life of our planet. So to help us with this task tonight, we have a range of perspectives that we're bringing together. And let me say a few words of introduction. Richard Eccleston will begin our conversation shortly. And Richard is a professor of politics and public policy at the University of Tasmania, and since 2014 has led the university's policy engagement, first as founding director of the Institute for Social Change, and since 2020 as the founding director of our Tasmanian Policy Exchange. And over that time, Richard has led projects on a wide range of significant issues, from housing affordability to migration to regional employment and assisted dying. And over the past 12 months, he has worked with staff and students across the university to make significant contributions to the state's energy and climate policy discussions. We've got Nikki Eisen joining us tonight, and Nikki is the Energy Transition Manager at WWF Australia. And Nikki leads the organisation's Renewables Nation campaign, working with governments and researchers and the private sector to accelerate Australia's transition to become a world-leading renewable energy export powerhouse. Nikki is an engineer by training and has extensive experience in working in renewables, climate, community, energy and environmental sustainability. We have Richard Gardner with us, and Richard has a vision for a diverse agricultural set of businesses that he manages, and his aim is really to ensure that as an industry leader, he is a front runner in helping guide industry to the agriculture industry to the more sustainable future. He has established a stock feed and manufacturing and wholesale business to supply the majority of pet and rural retailers in Australia. And always looking to drive innovation, he has been an early adopter of agricultural and irrigation technology and involved in a wide range of industry productivity groups and initiatives, and an advocate for a more professional and science-based approach to agriculture. And given this background, it is perhaps unsurprising that he's committed to developing innovative approaches to reduce farm-based emissions. And is currently hosting one of the largest farm-based trials of seaweed feed supplements on his 1,200 herd dairy herd in Annandale near Tunbridge. Ben Sandow is also with us, and he is the General Manager at Elphinstone Proprietary Limited, a business who is exposed to the impacts of a low carbon economy on a global scale. And to respond to the rapidly increasing customer demand for low emissions underground mining equipment, Elphinstone recently commenced a multi-year project to develop and commercialise battery electric underground mining support vehicles. Ben is a chemical engineer by training and has worked in primary industry, food manufacturing, and heavy engineering in technical, project and leadership capacities. So people able to help us work and think right across the breadth of our economy tonight. So to get ourselves underway, I'll invite Richard Eccleston to spend some moments mapping out an overview of the challenges and opportunities. So Richard, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rufus, and good evening, everyone. And I too would like to acknowledge the Tasmanian Aboriginal community as the traditional owners of La Truita, particularly given the topic that we're discussing tonight, to acknowledge the significant impact of climate change on country, and also the need to really embrace their traditional wisdom and knowledge that's been accumulated over thousands of years. As Rufus mentioned, I've had the privilege and my small team of working with colleagues, staff and students across the university to really think about how Tasmania as a state can embrace and engage with the challenge of climate change, and hopefully capitalise on some of the opportunities associated with the transition to a low carbon economy. So I'll just provide a very quick background or overview of that work as a conversation starter. I think we all understand and appreciate the problem. At present, we're heading for global warming of approximately or greater than 2.5 degrees, and the catastrophic consequences that will flow from that, unless we can reduce emissions aggressively and quickly. And given our dependence on fossil fuels, or the economy's dependence on fossil fuels, this is going to require really a significant transformation right across the global economy, and indeed a transformation for the community in which we live. We need to make things, we need to move around our community in different ways. And that's going to be challenging. It's a challenge that we need to embrace. So then the question is, how can Tasmania respond to this fundamental challenge? Is there a silver lining for us here in Tasmania? What are some of the opportunities and what are some of our assets? Our analysis really highlighted, I guess, 3, and Rufus has mentioned 1 or 2 of these in his opening remarks. We are one of the few places on Earth that's already got a net negative emissions profile. Our forests and land remove more carbon dioxide than we pump into the atmosphere from transport, agriculture and heavy industry. So that's a really strong foundation from which to build. but more needs to be done. We're also almost self-sufficient in terms of renewable energy. So while most places and economies are really focused on how they can reduce their dependence of electricity and energy systems on coal and gas, we've already solved that problem largely and can really focus on the next set of issues. And I think there's also an advantage around scale and place. We're a small island. It is easier for us to work together. We've got a deep commitment to sustainability, central to our identity and to our brand. I think if we can creatively pull those three elements together, we really can make a significant contribution and provide an example to the rest of the world in terms of how to respond strategically and proactively to the climate challenge. So what's the agenda? And as Rufus mentioned earlier this month, the university published a discussion paper to identify the key elements of a future-orientated climate strategy for Tasmania. The first one was, unsurprisingly, to maintain our current emissions profile, but noting very clearly that that's easier said than done. By our estimates and some of the government's own modelling, the amount of carbon that will be removed by our forests and land, even if we manage them relatively carefully, could be as high as 30% by 2030. So therefore, to maintain that profile and the really clear environmental benefits from that, as well as the broader social and economic benefits, we need to start reducing emissions right across the economy. Adaptation is very, very important. We won't talk about that in depth tonight, but as we know, the climate is already over 1 degree warmer than it was at pre-industrial times. And as a community, we need to understand those risks and respond to them to protect our environment, our communities, and our industries. And obviously agriculture is one of those key industries. The key point I think we're going to talk about tonight is why it's also really important to innovate and to develop and apply low and zero carbon technologies at a scale here in Tasmania, really for three reasons. First of all, to reduce the on-island emissions and maintain that net positive profile. Secondly, and I think Ben will talk about this, it's going to be critically important to future-proof our economy and our export markets, because increasingly consumers are demanding low and zero emissions products. Our key trading partners like the EU are contemplating tariffs and other measures against products which have high embedded carbon. So we need to respond to that to maintain our competitiveness. And finally, by using our expertise and assets and renewable energy infrastructure, we need to be able to develop and deploy technologies here in Tasmania at scale. And some of the work that Richard and colleagues are doing in terms of reducing livestock-based emissions are a key example of that. Because at the end of the day, being at the cutting edge of decarbonisation is going to be a really important source of competitive advantage in the global economy in the coming years. And if we can build that reputation for innovative approaches to reducing emissions, we'll be contributing to the overwhelming climate challenge we're facing, but also it will help ensure the longer term prosperity of our economy. That transition's not going to be easy, but tonight's really about starting the conversation and hearing from colleagues here in business in Tasmania and also nationally about some of the opportunities that are associated with embracing a climate positive strategy. So I think I'll leave it there, Rufus.
Thank you very much. Richard, for kind of framing that up. Nikki, we might turn to you next to provide us with perspective from the work that you've been doing.
Thanks, Rufus. And I suppose I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on Aboriginal land and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I live and work on Gadigal land in Sydney, and Richard and Rufus asked me to give a bit of a national perspective and how put Tasmania in context. And I suppose the place I wanted to start was that the climate crisis is here. 2 years ago, we saw the start of the summer of fires. They were raging by this time 2 years ago. And I understand things have been pretty cold in Tasmania recently, so it might be hard to imagine, but it was a pretty terrifying period. And we at WWF released a report that said we estimate that 3 billion animals were impacted by those fires. There was also loss of life. Then if we look upcoming, we're also doing work nationally and internationally about the Great Barrier Reef and how that should be declared endangered because of climate inaction and the threats of climate change. And then you look at various different impacts in Tasmania, in Australia and around the world, not just on ecosystems, but on people. And the disruption to people's lives and the threats to people's lives of the climate crisis, and that we are tracking to the very worst scenarios that scientists have modelled and predicted. And so that means that we have the critical decade, this decade now, to globally halve our emissions. And in Australia, as a country that has contributed significantly more than most countries around the world to the climate crisis, we have a responsibility to do more than that. So we need to take that seriously. And I think one of the exciting things about Tasmania is you can provide a pathway to so many other places around Australia and around the world of how to do this. So what's happening nationally and globally? So in Australia, we are highly dependent on fossil fuels, the largest contribution to climate change. Domestically, our biggest contribution to climate change is our coal-fired electricity. Non-domestically, our biggest contribution to climate change are our fossil fuel exports. Tasmania can play a role in helping with both of those. So at WWF, we have the bold and ambitious goal of making Australia a renewable superpower. And we talk about that as involving 3 steps, and they're concurrent steps, not sequential steps. So the first is we need to move to renewables and storage in our electricity system. And the good news is for Tasmania, you've already gotten there. You're a net 100% renewables, still a little bit of gas in the mix for your electricity needs. Then the next and the other piece, the second piece of becoming a renewable superpower is we need to move to renewables and decarbonise our total energy needs. So that is the energy needed to power our homes, our transport and our industry. And if you look at the analysis around the country and the studies that have been done, that says we need to double to triple the size of our electricity system, move to 200 to 300% renewables to decarbonise our energy needs. And so I would say that Tasmania, having sorted the 100% piece, that is the challenge. We need to be looking at how does Tasmania take its leadership role and show how to rapidly decarbonise and move to renewables in the transport and industry sectors, and to a lesser extent the building sector, because you don't have the same reliance on gas as, say, Victoria does. But still, huge opportunities there. And then the final piece is about making us a renewable export superpower. And so looking at what we can do to replace our export industries with clean exports. And at WWF, we talk about 6 types of renewable exports. Hydrogen is the one that has a lot of buzz around it, and we see a really critical role for renewable hydrogen in decarbonising particularly heavy transport and industry in Australia and the world. And Bell Bay, as an industrial manufacturing centre, has an opportunity to be a leading hydrogen and what we call renewable energy industrial precinct. But it's not just hydrogen, it's also renewable powered products and commodities. We can make things in Australia with the renewable power that the world and Australians need, everything from steel to advanced manufactured products. Then there's the components and the recycling of components. So I'm really looking for Depends talk about electric vehicles and electric mining vehicles. But there's also batteries and a range of other componentry in the clean tech space. Our expertise. Now, Tasmania has one of the earliest renewable export companies in the country, Antura, as an exporter of its hydro expertise and now hopefully microgrid expertise. And then the final one is around our software and services, the technologies needed to integrate all of this. And there are huge opportunities I see for Tasmania. Hydrogen is one of them, renewable power products, but I think the expertise that exist around the shipping industry and the global maritime sector, the blue carbon CRC, and also in the agricultural space. I don't pretend to be an expert on that side of things, but I think there are opportunities to translate the expertise that you have into businesses that the world needs. So that's the challenge that we have set governments around the country. And when we released a scorecard earlier this year, we found Tasmania to be leading of all jurisdictions. Now, that doesn't mean that Tasmania will continue to lead. A lot more policy work is being done, and nowhere is yet taking the opportunity and matching the scale of the challenge, we think, to make Australia a renewable superpower, but we're on the way. Next week, we're going to release the second renewable superpower scorecard, so watch this space. But I suppose I wanted to finish with what I see as three key focuses and opportunities for Tasmania. Five. The first is industry. I think Bell Bay, as Australia's first renewable energy industrial precincts, which shows how to use renewable, and not just renewable electricity, but renewable heat and renewable feedstocks, could be a model for not just Australia, but the world. The second is, as Richard mentioned, Tasmania is a small place, a close-knit place. We need to make sure that the renewables transition, which is essential not just for the electricity piece, but for those other pieces as well, benefits all Tasmanians and is done in ways that benefit local communities where communities have a say. I spent a decade of my life doing community-owned renewables, and I know there's a couple of people on the call who've done the same thing. Tasmania needs to embrace a community approach to renewables, not just an industry-led approach. The third piece is leaning into the electrification, particularly of transport, and showing us mainlanders how it's done. And then I'm going to finish on something that may be a little controversial, but I think mainland Australia needs Tasmania's help. Like I said at the beginning, our biggest contribution domestically to climate change is coal-fired power stations. We have 3 of the dirtiest coal-fired power stations on Earth, just north of Tasmania in Victoria and the Latrobe Valley. And there will need to be significant firming. Different studies say between 6 and 13 to 39 gigawatts of firming in the national electricity market over the next 10 to 20 years. And Tasmania can help with that, and we need to do it quickly. The climate movement is calling for Australia to be out of coal by 2030. And if that's the case, where are we going to get that firming capacity from? And I believe Tasmania has a role to help accelerate us away from coal. So I want to finish there, but I want to say that I think Tasmania has the opportunity to not just do this in ways that create industry opportunities, but to showcase what best practice looks like from an environmental and a social justice perspective. And I really hope that we can work with a range of actors across Tasmania to help make that happen.
Nikki, thank you. Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. We look forward to coming back to some conversation. Already some very good questions generating here around all of those pieces. So Ben, we might come to you next.
Certainly, I'll just share my screen so you can see my screen. I'm trusting. Not heads, good. So I'm here to talk a little bit less about exactly what we're doing and more about why we're doing it. So I think that might be more relevant to this conversation. So Elphinstone, the name's been around for a long time. What we do is build machines that look like these. So they're manufactured to support underground mining. They don't actually do the digging or do the transport of material out of a mine. They're there to make sure that it's fueled, The roads are in good condition, concrete's delivered where it needs to be, dust is suppressed, and that sort of thing. So that's what we do. We have a fairly extensive range, and we have them all around the world. So when we're talking about the global reach of our products, we're participating on all continents around the world. So we see, I guess, lots of different perspectives on renewable energy, on low emission energy, ranging from some areas which are primarily focused on financial outcomes to others where there's a high degree of regulation, now probably a high degree of stakeholder requirement for them to meet certain emission standards. So recently we've been successful in obtaining a government grant to start developing battery electric vehicles. So we will be developing them around the structures which we already have. The second slide I showed you, where we have a range of products, will basically be incorporating electric drivetrain into those. But I guess the question is why? If you look at it purely from an economic point of view, it doesn't really make sense in mining yet. So there's a number of other pressures that are contributing to this. So the primary one is really health and well-being of workers. So this is the reason why governments in certain parts of the world, such as Canada, are starting to regulate fairly heavily against internal combustion engines in mining situations. Coupled with that, like I said initially, it's about the stakeholder pressure. So I guess the power of the stakeholder for these big companies is really driving some outcomes. So why is it so bad for our poor old miner that's stuck down the hole? A diesel engine emits a lot of particulates, a lot of diesel particulates, which have been linked to all sorts of health issues in long-term miners. And they also create a lot of heat. So if you're talking about working 2 kilometres below the ground, it's about 55 degrees down that far. Plus, if you add heat from internal combustion engines, you're going to make that even higher. So what they do is they put in some pretty extensive ventilation systems. So the diagram I've got on the screen here, the blue line is air coming in, the red line is air going out. Now, like I said, they're 2 kilometres below the surface. So moving enough volume of air down a tunnel, which is 2 kilometres long, to be able to make it a working environment that the workers are going to actually be able to survive and perform in, is quite an issue. And in fact, it's actually refrigerated air, not just ambient air. It's refrigerated air, even adding to the complexity of it. And they're big fans, so they look like this. They're not your average fan that'll power the ductwork in somewhere small. They're big fans, and even bigger from the surface. They're huge complexes of things. So for us in the underground mining industry, it's really less about the actual emission from the machine, which is doing the work down the hole. It's more about the flow-on effect of having an internal combustion engine that requires all the ventilation and cooling aspects. In fact, in most cases, the companies that are using battery electric technology have big banks of diesel generators sitting on the surface, creating the electricity to power them. So it's kind of counterintuitive. We're just moving the problem from one place to another, and I guess factoring in some inefficiencies by converting from diesel power to electricity, then electricity back down the hole, back into motive power. So in the end, and this is a mock-up of one of the machines which we'll be designing over the next little while. It's battery electric is here for its heat generation. It's less particles generated from the diesel engine. So in the end, you have less energy required for the fans and for the refrigeration, less diesel burnt to create this electricity on the surface. And I guess one that only clicked with me the other day, we're talking about some pretty remote places where these mines are. The amount of fuel which is used to get the fuel to where it needs to be is enormous. So you think of B double road tankers transporting diesel to the middle of Alaska somewhere on ice roads. It's actually very intensive getting the fuel to where it needs to be. Plus, you then burn the diesel. So I guess all this is starting to add up to a business case that actually works for our customers. If you look purely at a battery electric vehicle, it doesn't stack up. But if you look at all the other factors involved, it does. And we're starting to see some pretty innovative solutions in terms of how the electricity is actually generated. So this is a hybrid setup. So we've got the solar panels in the background there, quite a big field of solar panels supplemented by diesel generators at the front. Different places around the world, they're also starting to use wind power to generate their electricity as well. So they're really starting to close that loop. And our role at Elphinstone is to how we can help facilitate this and help make it a worthy project. So what's in it for Tasmania? I guess we all know that we've surpassed the 100% renewable energy target. We've got the 200% renewable energy on the horizon, and if we're not there already, and we really need to leverage that. So as a state, if we can supply battery electric or hydrogen powered machinery to the world from a state which is powered 100% by renewable energy, it tells a really good story and something that we should be really proud of. As a sideline, at Elphinstone, we also build buses. So you might ask why we build buses as well as underground machines. We had an opportunity to build buses for Metro. And I guess while this is you might challenge why this is relevant to the conversation today, this is somewhere where the local, the state and the federal governments can really help in bringing some of this technology to life and making it a bit more mainstream. So we've built 100 of these buses so far, 104 to be exact, which are scattered across the state. The company who we build these buses for, who owns the IP, have actually managed to develop a technology which can be evolved over time. So a typical bus will go through 3 major rebuilds through its life. The idea with these buses is they commence their life as diesel. After 7 years, they can be converted to battery electric. And then after the second 7-year cycle, they can even potentially be powered by a fuel cell. Once you get an electric drivetrain into a vehicle, the way you generate the electricity that feeds that is pretty flexible in some respects. And this is good for Tasmania because, and for us, for Elphinstone, because it lets us understand the technology and how it all works and how we can actually facilitate this type of thing into our own equipment. There are significant barriers. Refueling is a big one. This is a big challenge for underground mining. Looking at a hydrogen refueling station here, hydrogen hasn't really taken off in underground yet. Battery electric certainly seems to be the flavour at the moment, but I guess the sooner that we can start having public transport or government vehicles powered by alternate fuels such as battery electric or hydrogen, the sooner we can start getting all the infrastructure that's necessary around the state, and then we can all start as consumers embracing the technology as well. Okay, that's me.
Great, thanks very much, Ben. We'll look forward to coming back to some key kind of themes that you've opened up there. So Richard, to wrap up the kind of round of framing material, over to you.
Thanks, Rufus. So I'm going to stick pretty much on the topic of dealing with methane emissions from livestock, particularly sheep and cattle. I think there's a really strong opportunity for Tasmania to be a leader in this field. And obviously we know with what's going on with sea forest on the east coast, to developing the technology to produce Sparagopsis seaweed, I think we've got some great opportunities both on the production side of that solution, but also in the trialling and the uptake of it as well. So I'll just put a little presentation up. Okay, so here's some cows at Annandale. We run about 1,200 cows, 1,225 I think we're milking at the moment. I just want to talk a little bit about the scale of emissions that we're dealing with. And if I can get that to go to the next slide, can I? Sorry. So I don't want to get too heavily into the details around this information. So about 10% of dairy farmers in Tasmania, there's just under 400 of us. So 10% of us partake each year in a benchmarking process that's been developed by Dairy Australia. And as part of that benchmarking program, we actually also get a carbon calculation function out of the inputs that we put into the benchmarking. And you can see this is our benchmarking data from the year before last season. And really all I wanted to show you was, if you look at those coloured bands, they show you all the different areas where we're emitting greenhouse gases from our system. The light blue is the enteric fermentation. In other words, that's the cows burping as a component of our business emissions. You'll see that we, down the bottom here, we've got an average CO2 equivalence of about 12 kilos per kilograms of milk solids, which is the fat and protein we produce in the dairy, against an industry average of around 14. Part of that is to do with the fact that we've got a low electricity impact in Tasmania to do with our renewable energy. So just to have a look at that in another way and put some scale around it. Once again, we don't need to get too heavily into the details here, but the bit I did want to show you was that our business with 1,200 dairy cows produces around 6,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent a year. And 4,000 of that, or 2/3 of those emissions, come directly from the cows' methane emissions. I'm being very deliberate too in terms of putting these numbers up in front of you for a couple of reasons. One is that this was one of the key reasons why I realised we really had to do something when you saw the scale of the problem on one farm. And as I say, there are 400 farms in Tasmania. We're probably bigger than the average, but we've got about 1,200 cows. There's probably 200,000 cows, dairy cows alone in Tasmania. The other reason I put them up is I think there's a bit of an issue with our industries trying to avoid confronting this problem, and I have had a couple of situations where people have described the issue as the methane myth. There's people downplaying the concerns around methane, and so I just want to be. I think we need to be upfront as possible as we can as an industry about the emissions that are coming from agriculture. So we've done a fair bit of work in this business over a number of years, looking at what were likely to be the potential mitigants to the methane emission. And actually, when we first found out about this nearly 20 years ago, CSIRO suggested at the time that they'd probably have a vaccine within 5 years. Unfortunately, that never happened, and we've been waiting for a long time to start to see technical solutions come out. We've been tracking it for a few years, and over the last 12 to 18 months, it's become apparent that using Asparagopsis amata was the most likely technical solution to methane emissions in ruminant animals. There is still some fair bit of work to be done about what levels of reduction in methane we're likely to get from using Asparagopsis. There are also some uncertainties around the level of improvement in feed efficiency that we might get in doing it. And I'll talk about feed efficiency a little bit, because if you don't emit methane from an animal, you're actually retaining that energy within in the system, and that energy goes then to supporting either the livestock's, the animal's metabolism for production or just for living. So one of the ways we're looking at being able to fund the cost of feeding Asparagopsis to livestock is by identifying what the productivity gains are in feeding it. So I note here this 26% improvement has been found in some feedlot trials in Queensland done by CSIRO. We're looking probably at about a 9 to 10% production improvement in a dairy pasture system. The other thing I note for the purpose of this conversation, I think is hugely important for Tasmania, is that we've got both ends of the loop here in terms of, well, sorry, can't have both ends of a loop, but we've got both ends of the solution here in terms of the seaweed production and the work that's being done by Sea Forest and Sam Elsom in particular has been absolutely fantastic. So I've said that they are a global leader. They probably are the global leader in terms of Asparagopsis production worldwide. So I think there's a fantastic opportunity for this state on both fronts in terms of production and utilisation of this solution. So what can we do in Tasmania? One of our big challenges in our industry is actually proving the methane emission reductions on farms. It's one thing to do this stuff in a lab. It's a completely different thing to do this on 300 hectares with grass and 1,200 cows wandering around. So I think we've got to be able to prove that we are actually reducing emissions out of the work that we're doing. We've got to be able to identify what the productivity gains are from using a product like Asparagopsis. We've got to be able to get the seaweed products into animals. One of the reasons that a lot of the work's been done up till now in feedlots and in dairies is that it's a very controlled feeding system. So every day our 1,200 cows come to the dairy, they get a measured amount of grain, and we've been adding a little bit of the Asparagopsis product on top of that, so we can very accurately control the input of the product to the animals. The problem we have in extensive grazing systems, beef cattle, sheep, wool sheep, meat sheep, is that they're wandering around a paddock eating grass, and it's very difficult to provide a controlled dose of the Asparagopsis active ingredient bromoform to the animals. So what do we need in ag? And I point some of this at the university, and I think the state more generally. So one of the things that we really need to do is start being able to test methane on farms. And this is, I'm no expert on this, but this is a significant technical and financial challenge to fund this. But I think there's a really great opportunity for Tasmania to be a leader on this front, is to be proactive in terms of being able to measure what's going on in response to any mitigation activities. Because I think unless we can really prove what we're doing, it's going to be difficult to have the support from industry and the general public around what we're doing. We need to do more on-farm work around measuring productivity. So we did the first trial we did last year, feeding Asparagopsis to half our cows. We found it challenging to be able to really identify what those productivity gains were, and that's mainly to do with just the variability in our system at the scale we're operating at. So we're doing more work on that at a lot more granular scale this year to try and see if we can nail down what those productivity gains might be. And we also need to do a lot more work into research into feeding systems for extensive livestock. But the last area around the feeding systems, this is going to be an important factor for mitigating methane emissions all around the world. The red meat industries, dairy industries across the globe are all facing this problem around methane emissions, and so there's huge opportunity if we can be a leader in this front in terms of developing the sort of feeding systems that are required. And that's it for me, I think. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Richard. Look, we've got a series of really interesting questions here around the various themes of building on each of the themes of our speakers around managing the transition in their areas.
Sorry, I'm still trying to get rid of my screen.
No worries.
You've got my screen, have you, or not? Oh, here we go.
There we go. All right. Well, since we've ended with you, Richard, I might start with you. A really interesting question here about the application. So you have the question is, you've got a captive audience of dairy cows and feedlot cattle. What, in terms of food pellet intake and consequently seaweed dosing, what can be done to help our pasture-fed Angus cattle in Tasmania if they don't access pellets? And if a vaccine isn't available, is there a pasture spray, for example? So, yeah, where do we go with that? That's an interesting question.
So I think this highlights exactly my third point around developing technologies for this. And I think the options that have been thrown around at the moment are things like having a feed source in the paddock, like a pellet that they can come and access. For livestock, we use a block that is made of molasses and salt and a few other things that animals really attracted to, that they come and lick. So it's used quite extensively in the pastoral areas on the mainland. That could be a delivery mechanism. One of the other ones is that there are some slow release capsules that are administered to animals as well, that might administer, say, a product over 3 months. And so you actually give that animal that slow release capsule, and it sits in the stomach for 3 months, and it slowly releases the product. Because this, as far as we know, this product needs to be fed on a daily basis, but this is all the work that's still yet to be done.
Great, thank you, Richard. Look, Ben, I might come to you next, where you raised this kind of question around EVs versus hydrogen. We've got some real interest here around how do you think into that question? Obviously, here in Tasmania, we're thinking about hydrogen and its future, and clearly transport's a key option here. How are you thinking into that choice about which pathway and for perhaps what kind of vehicles we head down on this EV versus hydrogen choice?
Yeah, well, I think it's going to evolve over time. At the moment, the biggest challenge with hydrogen is the availability of fuel, particularly in some of the areas which we will be supplying these machines into. There are certain pretty distinct advantages in using hydrogen power, such as it's much lighter in weight, so you don't need as much energy storage. You'll start continually generating energy. The refueling's faster. It's a bit unknown at this stage how robust it is. Like I was saying before, you're a few kilometres underground. You really want to be sure that your technology is robust and safe, and it's not going to catch on fire or not going to explode, which is probably no worse than anything else, but it's just unproven. I think we're going to be led by the industry on this one. From our point of view, the industry is seeking battery electric at the moment. I think it's an easier entry point into alternate fuels, but hydrogen will come along at some point in time.
Great. Look, thank you, Ben. Nikki, if I can come back to you, kind of these pathways to reduction. A question here, which is, we hear a lot of talk about keeping fossil fuels in the ground, but not much about deforestation. Of course, here in Tasmania, one of the reasons we are in the positive situation we are is because of change in kind of forest use. So the question is what is your view on kind of logging of rainforest, but perhaps more generally, what's your view around the kind of approach to forests as part of this whole equation?
Yeah, look, I think I've 3 points around this. One is, obviously the work the University of Tasmania has done as really demonstrate, how reliant Tasmania's current net zero status, net positive status is on LULUFC, on forests, and how that's been enabled by a change in forestry use, and how vulnerable, if that goes back in the wrong direction. And so how important it is to maintain Tasmania's forests, and particularly, beautiful ecosystems like rainforests. At WWF, I lead one of our flagship programs, Renewables Nation, and the reason we do that is because, if you look at climate change, 3/4 approximately of greenhouse gas emissions globally, and more than that in Australia, come from fossil fuels. And so that's why we're focusing on how to accelerate the replacement of that, and do that in ways that are as environmentally sustainable and socially just as possible. But one of our other flagship programs is called 2 Billion Trees. And we do a lot of work promoting the fact that Australia is a deforestation nation, a deforestation hotspot. And that is untenable from both a biodiversity ecosystem protection perspective, but also from a climate change perspective. And we're doing a lot of work to try and reverse that trend, and a lot of work to try and particularly secure much stronger national nature laws, and working with a number of other environment organisations and advocacy groups around that. It's not my particular focus, but it is as an organisation. And I think, maybe invite Richard to sort of talk a little bit more about some of the findings that I thought were fascinating in the UTAS net zero paper.
Great, thanks, Nikki. Richard, I might come back to you. So interesting, kind of challenging question for us around transitions here. The question has got a couple of bits to it, but we mine 500,000 tonnes of coal per annum here for use in Boyer and Railton, paper and cement production. The owners, they are overseas owners, and they could easily close down these facilities. Think the French owners of the coal-fired station in Victoria, and they could do it very quickly. I guess in lots of ways, this is a question which you could apply to a range of possible kind of industry transitions we could face. And so the question, which I think is generalizable beyond just these couple of facilities, is what do we do with our carbon exposed industries to help transition and not disrupt local communities, as has happened, many times here in Tasmania, where we've had these shifts that have been very disruptive to particular communities. How do we think into that challenge?
It's a huge, policy challenge, because in a sense, the change, as the question identified, is mostly been driven by economic imperatives, the choices of owners, investors, and consumers, and that's kind of an uneven trajectory. So we need to think about what those risks are, and I guess think about what the kind of contingencies can be. It's it's sort of like reducing tariffs and moving to a free trade regime like 20 or 30 years ago. It will be disruptive, the costs will be uneven, and that's really the goal of enlightened policy in terms of managing that transition. But scale here might be an advantage, because we've got relatively few industries that are significant emitters. So it's whether in having the conversation about where should be the priorities in terms of investing in new technologies, and where can we get the most bang for the buck in terms of reducing carbon, and also where the external risks might be, and having the contingencies around that. But it's right that we do still mine coal in the Fingal Valley that's used in cement and industrial processes, and that's some of the most challenging work, because the technology to produce cement in a low carbon way doesn't yet exist. So it's the holistic approach. The university's been at the forefront of trying to think about lower carbon building technologies to reduce the demand for concrete. If we do have to make it, how can we reduce the emissions? But that's probably at the end of that kind of process around decarbonisation. So it's that, I think, collaborative and partnership approach to understanding the opportunities to decarbonisation and the costs, but also managing the risks, because it will be an uneven kind of transition.
Nikki, please. Yeah, I was just going to come to you.
So one of the programs that we founded earlier this year at WWF is one called MECLA, the Materials Embodied Carbon Leadership Alliance. And what it is doing is brought together the whole business and government from across the industry, the building, construction and infrastructure supply chain. So on the supply side, you've got Boral and BlueScope Steel and others. And then on the demand side, you've got your Lend-Leases, your big renewable, sort of property developers, but also government infrastructure divisions. And the idea of this is to go, these are hard to abate sectors, but cement, steel, aluminium, glass, the foundations of that we use for building, but we must decarbonise them. And so what MECLA is about doing is three things. One is growing a demand signal. So saying, yes, as governments and as purchasers of these commodities, we recognise we'll need to pay a premium, but we want to purchase that zero embodied carbon construction material. So demonstrating to the market that there is a demand there. And then the second is pre-commercial, trying to create learning bodies and learning ecosystems around how to do this. And so there's a cement working group, there's an aluminium working group, and it's not just looking at carbon, but also at a circular economy approach. So how do we increase material efficiency as well? And I think one of the challenges for policymakers is where technologies don't exist, like in the cement space, or they do exist, but they're pre-commercial, what are governments going to do to help de-risk that, to help create the scale and to help bring those technologies down the cost curve? And is it possible to support the existing industry to go on that journey? And certainly that's what happened in the renewables, in the electricity space with solar and wind. You know, the programs like the Renewable Energy Target, feed-in tariffs, help de-risk, create an industry, bring these technologies down the cost curve. We've got to do the same in the other sectors of the economy. And if anything, we've got to do it more quickly. So that's really the role that we see for government policy. But also is going to be done in a way that protects and supports the workers. So where an industry and a business isn't willing to transition, how do you provide the retraining opportunities for businesses that into businesses and industries that might be?
Ben, I might come to you on this one. Elphinstone's played an incredible role in helping transition, you know, through Burnie, through some very disruptive kind of times. How do you see Elphinstone working in this next period of disruption as you change you change your kind of production focus and a lot of things going on around you? What role do you see yourselves playing in this broader transition in Tasmania?
Yeah, that's an interesting one in terms of Tasmania. If we look purely at the markets we serve, we sell very few machines in Tasmania for our underground mining equipment. However, with a contract such as buses, that's where we've really got an opportunity to make an impact here. Look, further to my presentation, I think it's really important that the government support these sort of initiatives so it can start building an infrastructure that everybody else can start to use. It's still very clunky to have a battery electric vehicle and not knowing perhaps exactly where you're going to refuel it, or it's a big barrier to going into a hydrogen system and not knowing when you're going to be able to refuel it. So there's a big opportunity for governments to help grow confidence in these sort of technologies. Buses are a great exponent of where this can be used because they've got predictable routes. They go the same way every day. They know what the loads are. They know when they're going to be back at the depot. We can certainly support in those endeavours and getting the equipment to those people and those government bodies so they can use it. And I guess for us, it's also about building the expertise within our engineering team, our electrical engineers, our mechanical engineers, and our tradespeople in terms of how they can build, how we can maintain, how we can develop the skills to design and actually utilise these sort of machines to their fullest, or these technologies to their fullest.
Terrific. Thanks, Ben. While we're on this kind of industries transitioning, Richard, it's a kind of an agriculturally themed version of it, which is a question saying, can we move meat production in the direction of wallaby meat as the emissions are minor and the damage to land by compaction also reduced? Are there more radical options here, Richard, we need to be thinking about?
I'm not sure about the wallaby meat one. I don't think I'm well placed to probably give you a good answer for that. I will say that the red meat industry worldwide has got some significant challenges, and it's not just about methane, but it's definitely one of our big ones. The other one is the energy consumed in the feedlot red meat industries. So there's a lot got to change, I think, and soon. There are also some arguments, though, that some of the extensive pastoral agricultural industries are actually beneficial from an environmental perspective, and I think there's some varying views on that. But some of Alan Savory's work around desertification and things like that suggests that maybe red meat livestock do have a role. As I say, there's probably some differing views on that, but I think it's going to be a long time before we can get away from sheep and cattle. There are a lot of them on this planet, and there's a lot of people rely on them for a food source. And my belief is that their ability to convert pretty average feedstock source like grass into good quality protein is actually pretty valuable for us. It's just that it's got to be done well and done in a sustainable manner.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you, Richard. It's a bit of a technical question, but it's a kind of interesting one. I think question is, if you proved a reduction in methane emissions in dairy, would it show up in official emissions data? I'm seeing Richard Eccleston nodding there.
Really good questions. There's a process, and the process for measuring emissions in terms of the UNFCCC framework that's used in Australia evolves constantly. And there are lots of debates about, are we actually appropriately capturing emissions from our forest and land? And similarly, as this technology is proven, it's verified through research, the sorts of partnerships we're talking about, it will be incorporated into the methodology. So at present, probably not. But that's why it is so important both to develop and deploy the technology, but also to verify its efficacy. And then it would, be included in emissions inventories and outputs both here in Australia and globally.
Yeah, I guess you can't underestimate the importance of what you're doing there, Richard, in terms of how dramatically that could change the Australian kind of conversation and kind of global impact. So very helpful to see that is really being captured. There's a part of this kind of a theme here around how we create the right incentives to get the transitions. Observation here around, and it comes to that question of concrete and heavy carbon materials, steel and other things. It's a question the university's sort of been very actively pursuing as we build on low carbon buildings. The question observes there are already mechanisms to build multi-storey buildings using cross-laminated timber, less steel, lighter foundations, quicker construction time, all very true, with less embodied energy. And indeed, I'd add they can be carbon sinks. The question is really about how do we overcome this question's around vested interests, but more generally, how do we get the shift to these new technologies which go to the core of some of the big carbon kind of consumption, methods of consumption? Agriculture is certainly one, but construction industry is a massive user of carbon. Very slow to see this transition happening. Maybe Nikki or Richard, any thoughts on how we accelerate some of these known technologies that can really make a difference to our carbon footprint?
So I'm going to riff off Meckler again and go, one of the sort of at least two other working groups in Meckler. One is around alternative construction materials. So laminated timber has a lot of focus, but the other is around procurement. And so one of the things is about building the capability within the demand side to specify what they want to demand. And know enough about the alternative products to be able to include it in design briefs, in architecture briefs, in contracts, in requests for proposals, in a whole range of other things. And so, I think there's a really important role for flagship demonstration projects and doing a whole bunch of industry education around it. So that's why it's been really great to see the Atlassian building proposal, which would be the world's largest timber building in Sydney. And so I think that will help be transformative, but then it's about building capacity on the demand side. And I think it's not just in the construction and infrastructure industry. I think the same could be said for the food industry around how do you support supermarkets and others to specify demand, contracts and open up markets for alternatives and things like that. Not that I want you to go out of business, Richard, of course, but I think that we often look at the supply side and too often ignore the demand side. And I think that there is so much opportunity to drive this transformation from supporting people to demand things differently. And that's at a consumer level, but particularly at an institutional level. So a business and a government and a university level. And I think that's why the conversation around Scope 3 emissions and supply chains from a climate change perspective is so important and so powerful, because it requires companies and businesses and universities not to look beyond their own immediate operations.
Great. Look, thank you, Nikki. We're coming close to the end of our time. So what I'd like to do is, rather than finish with the kind of closing statement, is to invite each of our panelists to help us finish with a closing question. One of the things that Richard Eccleston's been very keen to point out is that we're at the beginning of a kind of deep conversation that Tasmania needs to have about what are the questions we need to answer if we're going to make this transition. And so I'm interested to hear from each of our panelists as a kind of wrap up is what, from your perspective, sitting in the bit of industry or perspective you've got, what is the question you think Tasmania needs to think about if we are to be making this transition to really lead the world in this next era about being a model for what it is to be a truly carbon positive, climate positive economy. So I might start with you, Richard Gardner, and then head around. What are we got to be asking ourselves?
I think we've got to be asking ourselves, and Richard Eccleston highlighted this at the start of the talk, what are the opportunities Tasmania has to be a technical leader, an industry leader across these fields? And obviously in our field, agriculture, and particularly this methane emissions area, we have a great opportunity to be a leader worldwide, a global leader. So I think for me, it's not just what are the opportunities for Tasmania to reduce our emissions, what are the opportunities for us to lead the world, I think, in technologies.
Brilliant. Thanks, Richard. Ben.
I think the question on my mind is, for all of us, what am I going to do differently? Am I going to seriously consider getting an electric car? Am I going to seriously consider alternate building materials to use on my house or my extension? What can I do? How do I make a difference?
Marvellous. Nikki.
I think a question for Tasmania is, how do we create win-wins? How does Tasmania create win-wins? Things that are good for renewables and good for nature, good for the community and good for business. You know, how do we create situations and solutions, new industries, accelerate decarbonisation in ways that don't play into trade-offs, but try and create multiple benefits and multiple beneficiaries at the same time?
Brilliant. Thank you, Nikki. Richard Eccleston.
I've got a bit of a dilemma. A, I've been asked a very tough question by my boss. B, I think Nikki and Richard and to an extent Ben have kind of stolen my thunder. But how can we work collaboratively so that we can transcend some of the divisive politics that is occurring internationally, particularly at a national level around climate and energy, and historically been a challenge for Tasmania in terms of conservation? Because there is an opportunity. We will have to work really hard and work out what our priorities are. But I think, you know, how can we bring the community on board? You know, the vast majority of people want action on climate, but how can we steer that conversation in a productive and strategic way? And I think that's our collective challenge. It's not just for government, but it's for all of us.
Terrific. Well, Richard, on that fantastic theme of collaboration, can I thank our panelists tonight? I think this has been exactly the kind of conversation we need to have, people representing all sorts of different parts of the Tasmanian economy, perspectives from out of state, asking these questions about how it is that we're going to make this transition, and the kind of imagination, innovation and creativity that is going on in order to be tackling that challenge now. And all of our panelists have given us a real chance to see that in a great way. So my thanks to all of our panelists tonight, to everybody who has joined us. It's been great to be with you, and travel safely if you're traveling tonight. Thank you.